Well, welcome again to our next session. This one is, it's a mixture of different topics, but I'm sure they're going to hang together very well. And I'll say I was going to introduce Stella Hatton, but I'll leave that to later. And we'll start with Gemma Smith, who's a researcher in the Department of Celtic and Gaelic at Glasgow University. And she's got a very nice punning title to her paper, which I'll let her introduce in a second. She studies place names as a source for ecological history, and she's involved in a PhD project at the moment, which is looking at the Shieling landscapes of the northwest of Sutherland. So welcome, Gemma, and please take it away. I'll just make you a presenter first.
Okay, is that working?
That's working, looks good.
Took a few steps there. Okay, so hello, my name's Gemma Smith. As Andrew's just told you, I'm a PhD researcher in the Department of Celtic and Gaelic at Glasgow, and I study the far northwest of Scotland with a focus on place names as a primary source. My PhD research is specifically concerned with Shielings, and it is one of these Shielings that I will be talking about today as a place central to the lives of island women, that island being Handa. So, Handa Island, a small island of around 760 acres off the west coast of Sutherland. Like the Sandays in Orkney and the Small Isles and Sandray near Barra, the name comes from the Old Norse word sand plus the generic element e for island, sand island. Gaelic speakers added Elin, their own word for island, and lenited the initial S to give us Elin Handy, later anglicised as Handa Island. Most likely Handa Island was named for its fertile sandy soils. Like the west coast of Ruastor, further south in Assynt, Handa is mainly comprised of red sandstone, the result of sediment built up billions of years ago when this landmass lay at the bottom of an ocean. The mainland of Edrahilis, over here, is predominantly comprised of Louisian gneiss. So Handa and Scourie, just to the south, are probably the two best patches of land in the parish. Handa was included in the estate of islands granted by Robert II to his physician Ferriker Leochie, Ferriker the Healer, in 1386, the islands of the northwest being prize spots for grazing animals. Ferriker is also attested in place names of the region, for example, Kerriker in Assynt, which comes from Camus Vic Eriker, Bay of Ferriker's son. Handa was laterally owned by both the Mackays and the MacLeods before falling into the hands of the Sutherland estate. Evander McKeever, the incoming factor in 1845, had persuaded the island's inhabitants to leave and taken the place into his own possession by 1847. Although he informs us that when he arrived they lived comfortably, and in the old statistical account of 1793, the Reverend Alexander Falconer says that despite a lack of arable, even the poorest folk in the area had cows. McKeever claims in his memoirs that after the potato famine, his acquisition of the island was an immense relief and an immense blessing for most of those who went. In 1891, the island was passed from McKeever to a hotel owner in Scourie in order to compensate him for the hill grazings he lost under the Crofters Act. Handa has been uninhabited ever since, bar a few seasonal bird rangers. During McKeever's tenure, the island received a visit from the pre-Raphaelite painter John Everett Millais, a guest of the Duke of Westminster, who conveniently for me painted a milkmaid once, although this clearly was not on Handa. These did, however, happen across a group of bird fowlers on the island and expressed regret that he had not time to paint them. So the world sadly lost out on a pre-Raphaelite depiction of Guga hunting, and we'll have to make do with George Cook's lovely wee etching here instead. The old statistical account for Edgerhillis includes the story of John MacLeod of Handa, a member of Shield Torcal, who was responsible for the murder of Judge Morrison of Lewis, ally of James VI at the turn of the 17th century. But we are not here today to talk about the men of Handa. My interest in the lives of the island's female inhabitants was piqued by another detail shared by McKeever in his memoirs, where he says, "When I came to here in 1845, I found Handa occupied by 7 crofter tenants, with a queen among them. To her I was introduced the first time I went to the island." So, according to Malcolm Banker Jones, this was most likely to be the widow Williamina Morrison, who is attested as leaving for Nova Scotia the following year in advance of the rest of the islanders. It's not unusual to find a queen in the Hebrides, a famous example being Anne Ferguson, Queen of St Kilda, although in that case she was the most beautiful unmarried woman, whereas Handa's queen was the oldest widow. To bestow this title and status as a community representative on a woman is suggestive of a level of respect and authority that is maybe surprising to modern preconceptions. Interestingly, it is the mistreatment of widows specifically that McKeever comes under fire for from the local folk in the minutes of the Napier Commission for Kinloch Bervie in 1883. The estate management is criticised particularly for not allowing widows to act as community delegates. But with a long absent population and no known record of their own stories, how can we find out about the role of women in the life of the island? Well, all we need to do is look at the map. Which brings us to our island Shieling. The Shieling in the Gaeltacht being a predominantly female domain. We can see here on the map of Handa, Try na Harry, sandy beach off the Shieling. According to Highland Council's online archaeological report on the site, apparently they had doubts as to whether or not this is actually a Shieling, which perhaps raises the question of why it would be called that. Gaelic place names tend to call a croch, with the odd, notably metaphorical exceptions. Funiac, for example, in Gaelic, a huniac, the milk pail, so called because of the milk produced by the animals pastured in its corries. And we don't need any more of an excuse to show a picture of fair cognac. The archaeological report bases its doubt on the fact that Handa's Aran is only 10 minutes walk from the main Bala, which was located on the southeast side of the island at the largest expanse of arable and with easy access to the mainland. It is there that we find the remains of the old burial ground. The mistake here is to assume that a Shieling had to be far away from the home farm. Every Shieling site is different and specific to the landscape in which it is located. In the Scottish Highlands, the distance between the Aran and the Bala varied wildly depending on the specific circumstances of the region. There are, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, 2 kinds of transhumans, Mediterranean and Alpine. In the Mediterranean system, animals are moved very long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, as their winter pastures become too dry in the summer. Alpine transhumance is more accurately classed as an integrated system of agriculture practiced in regions where arable land is scarce. You move your herds to another pasture removed from the home farm to free up arable land for crops in the summer growing season. This is practiced most often in mountainous regions, where the summer pasture, often located at a higher altitude than the home farm, is inaccessible in winter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how far your Shieling is from your home farm, as long as it is far enough away that your animals can't wander home and spoil your crops before anyone notices. So, in this case, 10 minutes walk is just fine. If we look at the topography of Handa here, that 10 minutes walk is up and along this narrow channel or defile over to this little bay on the west coast, separating it quite nicely from the Bala. I like to think that this bit might have been called Glach na Himrich, or Pass of the Flitting, a fairly common Gaelic place name indicating the route to the Shieling. If any of you have ever walked up to Loch Crocach, that's Antler Loch in Assynt, the path from Rúcarn, Shieling of the Cairn, follows a pass called Glach na Himrich. And we can also see here the furthest extent of the Shieling grazings up at Siún, Cove of the Goats. In my place name survey of Ascent, I found that goats were as commonly attested as sheep and second only to cattle and deer. Goats were kept in huge numbers, particularly in the mountains northwest, before improved farming brought in a monoculture of modern sheep breeds. Anyone who's visited Noidar or climbed in Chalach may have come across the feral remnants of these flocks. The statistical accounts again tell us that the number of goats kept in Edrehillis dropped from 1,307 in 1793 to just 417 by 1845. The focus of the elite economy shifted from cattle under the old system to sheep, but goats had been kept mainly by the common folk as a source of highly nutritious milk, cheese and early spring meat, and their wool and skins were also traded. At the Shieling, so we are told by Marion Campbell and BRS McGaw in one of a series of 4 short articles on goat keeping published in Scottish Studies in the 1960s, cows were kept closest to the Shieling huts for dairying purposes. Sheep would then occupy the higher pastures and goats the rockiest outcrops of all, like the steep slopes of Siún on Handa between the Siún Moor, that's the Great Fairy Hill, that's a demarcation of the wild, and the sea cliffs to the north of the island. The wilder, wilier goats essentially assisting with the herding of other animals, as Campbell puts it, adjuncts to sheep management. They will also fight off foxes and other outside threats. Another reason why Handa's Shieling is so located should be obvious from this illustration from the new statistical account of 1845. There are a few other places in Handa where you can position a Shieling where your animals were not in danger of wandering off a cliff. Handa is now best known for the seabird colonies that inhabit its northern side, and like the St Kildans, the Handa Islanders also sustained their community with bird fouling. Back on the map, we can see here on Handa, Stac na Fulicia, Stac of the Seagull, and just along to the west there, Stac and Chefach, Stac of the Hawk. McKeever tells us that on top of Handa's rock cliffs, the rare peregrine falcon makes its nest, no doubt due to the seabirds, gulls being the favourite kill of coastal birds of prey. Inland, it's wood pigeon, minimum effort, maximum reward. So back to our Shieling or Ari. Sadly, due to the past year's Búrach, I have been unable to visit Handa yet, so thank goodness for Geograph. This photo is taken looking back at Trinahari from the north. In the Northwest Highlands, there are 2 main generic toponymic elements associated with Shielings. Ruye, which comes from the word for the slope of your forearm between the wrist and the elbow, and Ari, which Gillian Fellows Jensen traces to the early Gaelic word erge, the meaning of which developed the specialised sense of a summer milking place. This word also passed into Scandinavian usage as the element erge, which Ryan Foster has compared with setter, another generic Old Norse Shieling element, which gives us the numerous Western Isles place names ending with shadder, for example, Grimshadder in Lewis. Foster's analysis found that erge names were applied to prime grazing land, with setters being less fertile soils that produced vegetation with a higher nitrogen content, which is better suited to the raising of beef cattle, suggesting that Ari indeed specifically indicates dairying activity. It is possible, therefore, that Ruye is an equivalent to setter. It has also become clear to me in the course of my most recent research that, as Albert Bill suspected in his work on Perthshire, Shieling place names don't necessarily have to contain a Shieling generic element. In fact, maybe only about half of them do, although that's a subject for a whole other presentation. So how might our Handa-Maid have occupied herself at the Ari? Managing her herds and dairying activities were obviously her top priorities. For accounts of this, we need to look back to the oldest published material on the subject. By far the most detailed depiction of everyday life in the Shieling by Duncan Campbell was published in the Transactions of the Inverness Scientific Society Field Club in 1896, the author being brought up in a community where Shieling practice was within living memory for the older generations. This is the one source I've found that mentions hygiene, a matter that as an ex-caterer concerned me deeply. Campbell describes how extreme cleanliness was a traditional gospel among the Shieling women, with each Ari being located next to a fast-flowing burn for the constant supply of water that would have been required if they were to avoid poisoning the whole Bala. Here, next to the sheep bank, we can see depicted on the OS map of Handa at Try Nahari. We can see this unnamed burn, let's call it Alt Nahari. It's likely then that the original Shieling huts were nearby and that the sheep bank may even have been constructed from their stones. Fuel with which to heat your water would obviously been another necessity. Presumably here peat would have been used, although it's possible that some trees may have grown in this hollow in the past. Bovine TB was obviously a real hazard if you were producing food for your community, so another appeal of goat's milk was its prophylactic qualities. Tuberculosis is rare in free-range goats and it was considered the safest for children. As Marion Campbell says in her Scottish Studies articles on goat keeping, there was indeed an 18th century craze for visiting the Highlands in order to partake of the goat milk cure, which was thought to be actively medicinal. Duncan Campbell's article details the range of dairy products that came out of the Shieling, with fine butters and cheeses, the surplus of which would go towards rents or to be sold in the lowlands. A variety of cheeses were made from different proportions of cow, sheep and goat's milk, a mixture of all three being considered the best. Some were eaten fresh and some preserved by smoking or salting. An advantage of this coastal area here is the nearby seawater that would have been used for such purposes. Animals would also be bled to make a kind of marag dŵ or black pudding, although there is only one mention of this published in a 1927 Gaelic text called Eich Chi na Bennu. Crops would also have been raised wherever there was viable ground. The OSA tells us of small plots of oats and beer that were harvested using the Cascraum. Using Google Earth, we can see here the imprints of Yakkin or lazy beds in English for growing potatoes all around the Shieling site. See all these little stripes here, right up in all these little hollows. Some are even perched on the cliff edge over on the far end of the island, like these ones here on a very steep slope on Doon on St Kilda. Additionally, before sheep's wool came to dominate in the 19th century, in many Highland locations, flax was woven into fine linens and mostly sold for profit. Again, this task would have been the responsibility of the Shieling lassies. So as we can see, our Handa-Maid's duties were extensive and wide-ranging. She would have been a key player in the economy of the Bala. Overseeing Shieling activities for the first season would have been a rite of passage and a position of great responsibility. If successful, the Handa-Maid would not only have learned new skills, but would undoubtedly have earned status and respect within the wider community. Additionally, her Shieling activities benefited the animals, who absorbed a different set of nutrients at their summer Shieling pasture. At Try Nahari, they would also have had seaweed. And it also benefited the health of the land itself, with many Shieling locations becoming so improved through manuring that they could then be used for arable or in some cases permanent habitations. I love this picture. It might just be pure romantic Victoriana, but just look at the attitude of sassy lady. Anyway, over the 20th century, there were but a smattering of historical studies of Shieling life in the Highlands, with the last major work completed by Albert Bill on Perthshire Shieling in 1990. More recently, archaeologists such as Eugene Costello in Ireland and Eva Svensson in Sweden have highlighted the freedoms and responsibilities enjoyed by female herders during their summer season at the Shieling. This aspect of women's experience of the Shieling was not lost on Duncan Campbell in 1896. He in fact expresses a perhaps surprisingly enlightened view of the adverse effects of so-called improvement upon their lives, bemoaning the narrowing of young women's options after the abandonment of Shieling practice, which he explicitly links with the decline in rural populations, as well as the deterioration of the hill grazings themselves. With the independence granted to her, the opportunities for learning and skills development, the sociability and enjoyment afforded by the temporary distance from the Bala and the watchful eyes of elders, time spent at the Shieling may well have been the most free, satisfying and joyful days of a young woman's life, bestowing even mental and spiritual benefits. In a short chapter on Lewis Shielings in the 1927 book Gun Ona Biantiv, Voices from the Hills, Dr. Norman Morrison, also known as the Adarman of Lewis for his study of snakes there, goes as far as to say that the average Lewis lassie is a mystic with a romantic and poetic turn of mind. Like white lilies floating in the peat hag's dark waters, these daughters of the moorland are no common milkmaids. This he attributes to their time spent at the Aran, as he puts it, undisturbed by any sounds from Vanity Fair. I really wanted to finish with a short audio clip of Kitty MacLeod of Ness Lewis talking to Alan Lomax in 1951, but I wasn't able to squeeze it in, so please screenshot the link and have a listen to yourselves in your own time. It's only a couple of minutes long and it's just delightful. Kitty was from Ness on Lewis, where shieling practice persisted till the mid-20th century, and speaks very fondly of her own experiences. So that was our Handa-Maid's tale, or as close as we'll get to it without raising the dead. Perhaps not an actual queen, but certainly the dairy queen of the island, and all that from a single place name. This is what I love about onomastics. It can give us a glimpse of a way of life, even after the inhabitants of a place are long gone. All you need to do is open the map. To borrow a line from the Mi'kmaq poet Rita Jo, the place names are their monuments. Thanks for listening, and Slán Siofá.
Thank you very much indeed, Gemma, and I would certainly agree that onomastics is the route to understanding the culture of the Highlands. Thank you very much for bringing that alive. So there will be questions that we'll have later on. So we'll now move on to Siún. I'll just change the roles there. So Dr. Siún Carden is a research fellow in the University of the Highlands and Islands at the Centre for Island Creativity, and she's based at Shetland College. She teaches on the UHI's MA in Art and Social Practice and is the principal investigator of Home and Belonging. It's very nice to have Siún with us today, someone else who's based in Shetland. So, Siún, if you'd like to take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Gemma. That was brilliant. I'll just share my screen here. You can see that now.
Yes, looks good.
So I suppose I'm on the stories end of the Magic and Stories panel, and I'll be talking about knitting in Shetland and in Ireland. So some parts of this talk draw on a 2018-19 research project that was about skill, mostly in the knit industry in Shetland and Ireland, which was funded by the Carnegie Trust. And other bits draw on a 2017 study on the value of Shetland hand knitting, which I undertook with an organisation which I'll mention later called the Shetland Currymakers, the Shetland Little Knitters. So just to orient us a bit as to where we are, the Carnegie Trust project brought me from Shetland up at the top there to Fair Isle, Shetland's most outlying island and the home of Fair Isle knitting, obviously, and across to Ireland to field sites, including places in Donegal, Galway City and Inishmaan in the Aran Islands. Those places were chosen because they have clusters of knitting related activity, things like factories, shops, studios, tourism even. Shetland and Ireland, especially the west coast of Ireland, are associated today with kinds of knitwear named after islands, Fair Isle in Shetland and Aran in Ireland. While Shetland and Ireland each have very specific histories of knitwear design and production, the contemporary making cultures around Fair Isle and Aran knitting have a lot in common. In both places, we see a wide range of different kinds of textile making practice, ranging from commercial production to craft tourism, which are sometimes interdependent and which are influenced by a strong kind of heritage gaze. To give a quick idea of some types of contemporary commercial making in Shetland, Shetland College has a textile facilitation unit, which is a mini factory within the college itself, which serves students and small businesses. There are a couple of quite small scale factories in Shetland, like Jameson's of Shetland in the middle here, and there is a plethora of one person, mostly designer made businesses. On the island of Fair Isle itself, even though it only has a population of about 55 people, there's also this ecosystem of different types of knit production. So they have a kind of unofficial co-op called Fair Isle Made in Fair Isle, whose members all knit on hand frames the same range of products, mostly for the tourist market. They have a luxury knitwear business, which is quite design-led, and they also have individual designer makers doing their own thing. For instance, Cafe Cool. Beyond commercial production, what we see in Ireland is less integrated with public life. In Shetland, what we see beyond the world of commerce is that knitting takes place in domestic and familial contexts. There are Makkin and Yakkin groups in Shetland, as in knitting and talking, and those are some of the things I miss most in the pandemic situation. Knitting in Shetland has a competitive edge through things like country shows, and it's also part of an international online community of practice that's very active online and in connection to craft tourism. In Ireland, of course, there is non-commercial leisure knitting. It's not so tied to social life and public understanding as it is in Shetland, but Ireland is part of the same international online community of practice, so you're more likely to be in a Stitch and Bitch group in Ireland than a Makkin and Yakkin one. So in Ireland, there are small factories like Crital in Ishman, which we see on the left here across one of the stone fields of the Aran Islands. There are Aran-style jumpers of all sorts of provenance, including very cheaply made imports on sale anywhere you might expect a tourist, like in Galway City. And the whole tourist trail is strewn with every kind of Aran-related souvenir. There are also individual designer makers like Adele McBride, who is a designer and teacher and a great cheerleader for the Irish knit industry, and particularly the skill of Aran knitters in Donegal. So while knitting is of course practiced by people of all genders, and men dominate some roles in the knit industry, I've yet to speak to a woman factory owner, for example, and in the realm of software programming and things, you see a lot more men. As the author Joanne Turney writes in The Culture of Knitting, when one first thinks of knitting, one thinks of women. When interviewing mostly women and some men about what knitting skill is and how it is acquired, across the project in 2017 with hand knitters in Shetland and the later project with a more industry focused group in Shetland and Ireland, two themes are identifiable. The first is about the relationship of this kind of skill to other kinds of technological skill, like computer programming, engineering, or maths. So this comes up when people want to undermine the assumption that in design and technology, textiles are for girls, material are for boys, as Solanke says here. This also comes up when talking about the different roles in the industry, such as the dearth of skilled machine programmers and perceptions of a gulf between feminized academic textile education and masculinized disciplines like computing. The theme, which I'll talk more about today, is more widespread, and that's about enskillment as something that happens in kinship contexts, with knitting as a form of familial care and part of a kind of social reproduction. Christine Arnold used the phrase maternal osmosis to describe the learning process of some older Shetland knitters who quite commonly can't remember ever learning to knit, but sort of absorbed it from women in their family. And when you ask knitters about knitting, it is often the case that what you hear are family stories. So these are just a few examples from my own interviews about the family as the site of learning. The middle quotation here is a good example of the way that different, by which I mean like domestic and factory, hand and machine making, were very much enmeshed in Shetland in the late 20th century. And someone growing up in a household could be exposed to or involved in lots of different processes, from hand knitting gloves to finishing machine knit jumpers to knitting for a factory on a domestic machine, designing custom machine ferrule. So to illustrate the theme of kinship and social life beyond this sort of individual story, I'm going to mention two more general narratives. The first is the origin myth of the Aran jumper, which is an apocryphal story some of you may have heard about a lost fisherman. And the second is a narrative of skill loss from Shetland, which is about a lost generation of knitters. So starting with the origin myth of the Aran jumper, this is the idea that the ornate stitch patterns in these garments developed to allow the bodies of drowned fishermen to be identified by their families. One of the seeds of this story is in J.M. Singh's 1904 play Riders to the Sea, where a drowned fisherman is identified by a tiny mistake, just a dropped stitch in the sock someone remembers having knit for him. But that idea of a drowned fisherman being identified by his family because of the knitwear he's wearing becomes much embellished over time through a circuitous route. And this is just at the same time that Aran knitting itself is becoming more embellished and becoming established as a distinct thing and a thing that represents Ireland. And the two threads kind of married together, the drowned fisherman becoming a main part of the knitting's mythology. The idea that Aran knitting is a symbol of Ireland, with the island somehow standing for the nation, grows because of two flows of people. One is the migration of people from Ireland, particularly to North America, and the second is the return flow of tourists from North America to Ireland, many of them with some kind of interest in Irish roots. So this has been very much used by Ireland in its marketing, and one of many, many examples is here from back in 2015 when there was an event called The Gathering, which invited the diaspora home, very similarly to Scotland coming and Shetland came Aran. So The Gathering was promoted with this image, which shows people looking rather friendly, and the three women are wearing style jumpers in the colours that make up the national flag. The success of the Aran jumper as a symbol of belonging to Ireland, I think, is really closely tied in with that story of the drowned fisherman being named and claimed by his family. And the power of Aran knitting for tourism in particular is about undoing the loss of migration, healing multi-generational rifts. So the second we'll talk about is this one from Shetland. A narrative that shows up time and again in interviews with knitters is encapsulated in a phrase that one repeatedly used, that being the missing generation. So this is a story of the chain of maternal osmosis being broken around the time of the oil industry boom in the 70s and 80s, when women's employment patterns changed and knitting as a commercial activity became said. Knitting was seen by some as a kind of occupation of last resort, something you might have to do, probably not something you would do for fun or make a particular effort to pass on to your children. So as you see here, one interviewee says, you hear people saying, my mum always told me never to start knitting or you'll have to knit for a living. There's the idea that education is for going away and staying away or getting a job with pension, or for playing with knitting, as she put it. Yesterday, we heard Annie Thueson talk about how tourism received extra support during the oil boom years, and the same was true of knitting, as both were singled out as industries threatened by the changes. The extra support included funding for knitting tuition in Shetland schools. When that was withdrawn in 2010, which seems quite recently, one response was the creation of a voluntary group called Shetland Careermakers, which organises free, mostly ferrule knitting tuition for primary school aged children. The image here shows a little boy's knitting where he's chosen to depict crabs. The Shetland ethos is about filling in or leapfrogging the missing generations by supplying children with expert knitters, often older women, in as cosy a setting as you can manage in a school building. The Perry-Mackers secured leader European funding, private sponsorship from Alexander McQueen, and now have support from the Crown Estate. But in their early days, they were supported through crowdfunding, and they were able to draw on a large, overwhelmingly female international community of practice around Fair Isle knitting. The history of Aran and Fair Isle knitting often being closely intertwined, including being knitted by the same people, as we see here in this old quote from Mary McNellis in Donegal, who said, "We all knitted Fair Isles for Gaeltara Aran for a few years until the Aran sweaters became fashionable." I think they became popular with the Clancys. You remember the Clancys? They went to America wearing the Aran sweaters. Gaeltara Aran was a state development agency set up in 1957 to encourage business in the Irish Gaeltacht, fight deprivation, depopulation, emigration from this heartland of Irishness. So it's notable that they did that at first by getting people to knit Fair Isle style products. And it took the Clancy brothers going to America and famously appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1961 to really solidify the idea of the Aran as the ultimate Irish jumper in popularity and commercial awareness. Place-based products like Fair Isle and Aran knitting, there's often a bit of skullduggery around provenance. The popularity of Aran knitting in the 60s made for a shortage of skilled knitters. And as you can see here, less scrupulous companies were happy to misrepresent the provenance of the finished items. This is from an English woman who sent me her account of how our Belle used to write "Made in Sunderland" on the inside of the tags in tiny writing before she sewed them into place. It was her way of getting one over on Aran, as in the Aran company they were knitting for. While this is kind of a mischievous story, it points towards an issue that's already been mentioned by Shan Reynolds in her talk on Wednesday, the issue of naming knitters who are often anonymous, obscured within an idea of tradition that rests on nebulous, nameless generations. Naming knitters is now pursued both as a kind of feminist imperative and for commercial advantage. So craft tourists like the Shetland Wool Week visitors we see here are ravenous for personal details of individual knitters, both past and present. One Shetland knitter and knit professional I interviewed said, "It's a funny one. They do really want to know about you and your family. It's one that my partner hates. I don't think he realised. It's just the amount of people and they're so interested." On the retail end of things, high-end hand-knit jumpers for sale in places like Galway City now have labels signed by the knitter herself, certainly not with "Made in Sunderland" on the back. Anonymity brings me to the idea of every woman and knitting as the every woman's art. I'm not going to say much about knitting and art today at all for the sake of time, but I just want to nod to the notion of knitting as a creative repertoire that can be accessible to women when others aren't. On Wednesday, we heard a phrase from Jenny Gilbertson's film A Crofter's Life in more than one presentation. The phrase was "Every woman in Shetland knits." And this sense of universality is sometimes part of knitting's appeal for contemporary artists. Pauline Cummins, for example, talked about it as a fine art kind of creativity, which was always available to all women. This every woman idea is also one of the things in play when knitting is used as a creative element of political campaigns. I'm going to share two examples of this to close, one from Ireland and one from Shetland. This is the Irish comedian and actress Aisling B in an Aran jumper that she wore during the Repeal the 8th campaign, which successfully campaigned to remove the amendment banning abortion from the Irish Constitution in 2018. Aisling B wore this in TV appearances in the UK and Ireland, at demonstrations and obviously on social media, as you see here with the emoticons on this image from her Instagram. The emoticons are a good reminder that one of the functions of the garment here is to provoke an emotional response. The original traditional cream Bonnying Aran jumper was knitted by Faye Dinsmore in Donegal, and it was given the graffiti additions by an artist, Kira Harrison. Lastly, moving back to Shetland, this is one of a series of prints, lino prints made by D.M. Schofield in support of the Wiz 2 campaign, which was a Shetland response to the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and violence. As you can see, the figure of the woman here is absolutely swaddled in Fair Isle knitting. To conclude, I'd say that used like this, Fair Isle knitting carry an assertion of intimate belonging that gives campaigners' demands an extra potency. Their relationship to place, to a rooted collective identity, and especially to kinship, makes them, I think, more affective than, for instance, the pussy hat used in anti-Trump activism in the USA. The power of island knitting in these political contexts is in how concretely it evokes women's role in producing and reproducing social life. So I'll finish there and stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siún. Another fascinating insight into women's lives and the activities that are so important but rarely get the prestige that they deserve. So thank you. Selahattin hasn't appeared, so I don't know what's happened there. That's a great pity. He was going to talk about medical and the magical properties of Viking gender identities. If he does appear at some later date, perhaps he's misinterpreted the time difference or something like that, we might be able to squeeze him in over lunch or during a coffee break. But otherwise, I think we'll turn to the questions now. And a couple of questions came in for Gemma, which I see she's already answered. I think I'll ask them again in case she wants to expand a little bit upon them. We'll maybe leave the salting one. It's just something that's interested me. We've heard about salted butter over the course of the conference, and Gemma, you pointed to salted cheese, right enough the Cornish one. Very, very nice. And I know another way of preserving food is to dry it, wind dried, even in a damp climate seems to work. They do that in the Faroe Islands, and they used to do it in Shetland as well. Although what the result is very much an acquired taste, but it would be interesting to know how they collected their salt as well. But really, I just want to continue the onomastic question. I suppose rather than I'll just ask the same one. The surprise I meant really was there anything about women's lives and about just the general cultural background of Handa that surprised you from the place names?
No, from the place names. I must say I was the one thing that really surprised me researching the background of Handa, the cultural background, was in the minutes of the Napier Commission for Kinloch Bervie. They really go on about this. You know, they really go on about the fact that widows aren't being treated respectfully, they're not having enough rights, they're not being treated as community delegates. I think there's actually a line, there's like one guy who's from the area, I think he's from Scourie, who's going on about this for his whole testimony is all about this. And I think he actually says it's something along the lines of it is important for women to have their own representatives to represent their position. You know, it's really explicit, and it's really surprising to read. And they go on and they keep bringing it back up again, and they give Evander McKeever a really hard time about it at the end. So yeah, that was surprising to read, and delightful, obviously. But from the place names, they are on Handa really sparse. If you have a look at the map, there's not much, and sometimes when there's not much on the OS map, if you look back at the 6-inch first edition, you know, there's a lot of old names that'll come up, like old well names, and maybe there'll be a name for a burial ground and stuff like that. No. It seems like there was very little remembered, but I mean the population were shipped off pretty much wholesale, you know. Most of them actually left the country rather than just settling over in Scourie or whatever, so there was nobody to pass it on. So yeah, it's a slightly depressing case in terms of place names, sadly.
Well, yes, indeed. But I think the surprise is that you've managed to extract so much information from the place names when, as you say, the corpus is quite small. But you did give us a very interesting insight into people's lives. So thank you very much for that. And there's a couple of questions here for Siún as well. Leslie's asked, I love the women using their knitting as activism. Are there examples of this from other world communities that you might have heard of?
Yes, there's a lot of this all around the world, basically, including with First Nations communities, using weaving and so on. And there's a whole realm of craftivism across art and activism, where textiles, particularly that are associated with ethnicities or places, can be deployed and being taken into a new context or used in a different way, can give a kind of, they're a very powerful kind of tactile symbol. So there's a lot of it. There's so many that it's hard to think of specific examples, but there's a lot of it about.
Thank you. And well, there's another couple of questions coming in. There's another one about knitting. What about women who haven't been shown how to knit? Is there are women happy to pass on their skills to other knitters, or do they like to keep their own pattern knowledge to themselves?
That's a really interesting one. There seems to be, there's a big shift in knitting becoming hedonized, you know, becoming a leisure activity, becoming quite a high status leisure activity within a generation or two. So there may have been cases where it hasn't been a priority to pass it on because it's been one of the, because it's associated, one of the Irish professional hand knitters who still exists was saying how in her youth it had been associated with poverty, and that people would sort of pityingly ask her, was she still doing the knitting? Whereas, you know, now she's, her house is a stop on this tourist trail, and she's seen as this repository of kind of community knowledge, and a very valuable repository. So I think there's been waves of different kinds of value given to it. And in Shetland, there have been cases where women who are currently in their 40s have kind of rediscovered knitting, which their mothers would have done professionally, and the younger women are now building careers really in teaching knitting skills, whereas one of them told me that she's not nearly as skilled as her mum, but her mum would never have thought she knew anything worth passing on. Sometimes they teach classes together, but she has to really twist her mum's arm to get her to acknowledge that she knows more about knitting a Shetland yoke than the people in the class do. So I think there are different sort of generational things.
Yeah, that is very interesting how it's moving out of a sort of folk tradition into a sort of a different forum. following up that knitting in certain areas, is there something particularly connected between islands and knitting? Because you've pointed to your research is in island knitting.
I do wonder. I think there is in this part of the world. I think that in the case of Shetland and Ireland, part of the process of these styles of knitting becoming commercially successful and becoming seen to represent a place or a country is because the kind of cultural stuff around knitting, about coziness and domesticity, somehow dovetails with the cultural stuff about islands as small, bounded, authentic communities. And even with the world of fishing, there's a dovetailing in the kind of symbolism and iconography. So you get films like Flaherty's Man of Aran, which is part of how the vision of the Aran Islands is popularised, and Aran knitting is becoming a thing around the same time. So there's something to do with, I think it's the mythologies around knitting and the mythologies around islands that kind of coalesce in Britain and Ireland. And I'm not sure whether that's as prominent elsewhere, but it's definitely a thing here.
Thank you very much. There's a couple more questions for you, Siún, which I'll give you just in a sec. But Gemma, did the fact that Handa was an island, did that feed into your desire to choose it as a research object?
No, no. It was just to do with the place names, really. I mean, yeah, it seems a very long time ago when we put in our abstracts for this conference, and I suppose gender's not really a theme I deal with very often, so I was looking for something to base it in that I was comfortable with. So I had to find a Shieling place name or an island somewhere, and that was that. But it's ended up that I'm actually going to be using it as the basis for a chapter in my thesis anyway, because I'd started off looking at, I think my original proposed title was The Shieling in Northwest Sutherland, but then I quickly realised that that's massively reductive. So it's now called Shieling Landscapes of Northwest Sutherland, because it's obviously more about how the Shieling fitted in with the wider ecology. And in that respect, Handa's a really fascinating example, being an island and also tying into that kind of gender idea. So because each chapter as well, each case study will look at it through a different kind of lens. So Handa will be about gender, there's another one's going to be about human-animal kind of relations, etc., etc. So it's worked out quite well for me picking it anyway, but I was just looking for an Ari somewhere.
Well, that was a good choice of Aries, I think. Excellent. Okay, well, we'll just finish off then with a few of these questions. Again, about knitting. Knitting seems to have inspired a lot of discussion. So I think you can see them there, Siún. So maybe just we'll just lump them together and you can
Sure.
tell us what you think. So there's a gendered one there. Question. My uncle knitted. My dad knits as well. He knitted Icelandic jumpers, Lopi jumpers. Anyway, well, I've lost the question now. My uncle knitted while on voyages. Were there tensions between women knitting at home and men at sea? Does Ireland have an equivalent of the Shetland Wool Festival and Wool Week? That would be. And does Shetland knitting provide a way for women to support their households in marginal landscapes? And is that maybe something that links it to Irish islands?
The question about women knitting at home and men at sea, there's a fantastic book by Lynn Abrams about knitting in Shetland called Myth and Materiality in a Woman's World, and that's a good place to look for the kind of interrelationship of women and economic life in Shetland and men and economic life on the sea. And in the question about Ireland and whether it has a Shetland Wool Festival, one of the really striking differences between here in Ireland is that Ireland does not yet have anything like Shetland Wool Week, and there are some people there who are trying. And in fact, I know somebody who has just before the pandemic was trying to run a craft tourism tour that would take in both the west of Ireland and Shetland, because by the time people have come from America, it just feels like a short hop. But the idea of craft tourism as a participatory thing that people come to do and be part of has not yet really taken off in Ireland the way it has here. People are making big efforts. The fictional depictions of knitters is a great question. The role of Synge's plays is really important in building up the idea of or planting the seed of knitting as something that is important for the Aran Islands. And there are some really desperately unrealistic modern kind of romance style novels involving Aran knitting, which I wouldn't recommend, but they certainly do exist, and it seems to be a thing that that people are willing to sort of project onto a lot. The question about women supporting their families and marginal communities, absolutely, that has been a thing in Ireland as well. I don't want to talk for too long, but just the last thing I'd say would be the Inishmaan factory in the Aran Islands. That's an interesting example of how in Ireland the knitting industry was used as a job creation scheme, really, initially, to try and keep people in Ireland and other rural places. And that has now swung around. So there's now this very high-end, very successful knitting factory in Inishmaan, which can't get the staff. And now people get the boat over to the island to work in the factory. And that has had an interesting effect on the Gaeltacht education, tying in with Gemma's talk, because the Irish language school on the island now attracts children from off the island who get the boat to the island to go to school, whereas in the past it would have been the island children getting the boat to go to school on the mainland. So there is a kind of recentering and revaluing of knitting and the language in those places.
That's fascinating, and perhaps that's a good place to stop. I just see that Gemma's added a very interesting addition to the discussion. At the Shieling, it was apparently the young boys' job to knit and darn socks while they were there. So that's interesting, which brings, I suppose, well, time for another question. Did men and women knit different things?
There are lots of stories of men knitting at sea, and whether men and women knitted different things, they definitely seem to have mostly gravitated toward different sorts of roles in commercial knitting in 20th century in Shetland. So you hear quite a lot of people talking about the role of domestic machines in people's houses and how it's not at all uncommon for the man of the house to be machine knitting away on that. The things that men seem least likely to have been involved with were things like linking and finishing, quite fiddly, manual, repetitive jobs. And in knitting factories, I hear people say things like that they think women are more suited to those types of tasks, which sort of recalls work in the 1970s by Cynthia Coburn, about the idea of women having nimble fingers and skills being seen as intuitive and natural and not that skilled. The current situation in industry tends to be that there are big shortages of people doing fiddly little linking and finishing jobs. Those are some of the least well-paid tasks. There's also shortages at the total other end of the system with machine programmers, which in a way is odder because those are the best paid jobs in the industry, but people don't seem to know about them or be able to access training in them, things like that. And that is an area where you tend to see more men.
Thank you very much. So, well, I think we'll draw it to an end there. Thank you very much for another absolutely fascinating session. Lots to think about. And we can stop now for lunch, and we'll come back in the next session at 1 o'clock. So with my big sausage fingers, I will stop the session. Thank you very much, everybody.